Good morning. In this morning's gospel lesson, we find the Apostle Peter trying to get a better understanding of exactly how far he has to go when extending forgiveness to someone who he thinks has sinned against him. If that someone is a fellow follower of Jesus, shouldn't 7 times be sufficient? Jesus responds, "No, not 7 times, Peter, but 77 times. Jesus means always. You forgive always, Peter. Jesus uses Peter's question to begin telling another of his parables that illustrate how things are in the kingdom of heaven. There are 3 principal characters in this parable, a king and 2 slaves. The slaves are actually servants to the king, people we would refer to today as members of the royal staff. These servants will interact with one another, so to avoid confusion, let's give them names: Malachi and Ezra. The king is getting his finances in order, and an audit of his accounts receivable indicates that Malachi owes the king 10,000 talents. Now, in the Palestine of Jesus' day, it took a common laborer about 20 years to earn 1 talent. 10,000 talents was Jesus' way of saying $1 bazillion, an amount of debt impossible for Malachi to pay back. In order to cut his losses, the king orders that Malachi, his wife, his children, and all his possessions be sold. Consumed by despair, Malachi falls to his knees and begs that he be allowed more time to pay off the debt. The king knows such a repayment is impossible, but he is moved by Malachi's plea, and he forgives the debt. So there's the first message of the parable. The God who rules the kingdom of heaven is a God of grace and compassion and mercy and forgiveness, a God of love. All of us grown-ups have at one time or another had loans or accumulated debt to pay off, and we remember that great feeling when we finally reduced an outstanding balance to 0. Malachi undoubtedly felt the same way. He was walking on sunshine, and it felt good. That is, until he saw Ezra, another of the king's servants, coming his way. Ezra owed Malachi 100 denarii, a mere pittance when compared to what Malachi owed to the king. This is of no consequence to Malachi. The mercy, compassion, and forgiveness granted him by the king are replaced by anger. He physically accosts Ezra and demands payment of the debt owed him. Ezra's response is identical to Malachi's response to the king. He too falls to his knees and begs that he be allowed more time to pay off his debt. Malachi is not moved by Ezra's plea and has him thrown in prison. The king soon learns of Malachi's action and angrily rescinds his merciful judgment. He hands Malachi over to be tortured until his enormous debt is paid. $1 bazillion. That's a life sentence of torture. Jesus concludes the parable by issuing a warning to all those listening to him. The fate of the servant who lacked compassion will be theirs also if they do not extend heartfelt forgiveness to everyone. This is the second message of the parable. To remain in the kingdom of heaven, we live in accord with the qualities that God values most: mercy, compassion, forgiveness, and love. The parable ends with no further mention of the second servant, our fictional friend, Ezra. But since Jesus used this parable as a comparison with the kingdom of heaven, and Ezra dwells in that kingdom, I've come to the conclusion that at some point after being released from prison, Ezra forgave Malachi. Forgiveness is not a get-out-of-jail-free card that eliminates the memory of pain, sorrow, loss, or injustice. Ezra will forgive Malachi after he decides that rather live as a captive to the mental abuse, physical abuse, and unjust imprisonment he endured, he will use forgiveness to liberate himself from the bondage of those memories. He will use forgiveness to free his heart and mind from victimhood so that they may become instruments of God's peace. When I regard the world in which we live today, I can't help thinking that forgiveness is regarded as something soft, as something resorted to by people who don't have the fortitude to fight back when they've been done wrong. Payback and retaliation are far more satisfying than letting someone off the hook. And if you must forgive someone, then at least don't do it until someone comes to you and asks your forgiveness in a way you deem acceptable. That concept of forgiveness completely misses the point. Forgiveness is not soft, it is very powerful. It frees us as we give it. It removes us from the burden of needing to hear just the right words or discern what's in someone's heart or believe their remorse is genuine before we forgive. Forgiveness releases us from needing someone else to be remorseful at all. That being said, forgiveness is hard. It's difficult to refrain from lashing out in some way at someone who hurts you, who sins against you. And I found that forgiveness is even more difficult when someone hurts a member of my family or a dear friend. Maybe you feel the same way too. Like anything else you want to become good at, forgiveness demands practice. And how often must we practice forgiveness? Always, says Jesus. In a few minutes, we'll stand together and recite the prayer that Jesus taught us. We'll pray to God these words that we've spoken hundreds and perhaps thousands of times. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. The next time you take a moment to reflect on those words, remember this observation from John Paul Richter, a 19th century German author. He wrote, "Humanity is never so beautiful as when praying for forgiveness or else forgiving another." Humanity is never so beautiful as when praying for forgiveness or forgiving another. May God grant us the grace, mercy, compassion, and perseverance to reflect the beauty of forgiveness in our time in this world.